I thought I'd first of all just cover a couple things that are up right now in Congress. We still have some unfinished business from the last budget cycle, specifically the Homeland Security Department appropriation. What happened in December was there was an agreement for funding for federal agencies through the remainder of this fiscal year, which is to the end of September, with one exception, being the Department of Homeland Security. That expires at the end of this month. And in the House, a number of riders were attached to it saying that the funding could not go forward unless the President's executive orders related to immigration reform were rolled back, which obviously created a stalemate because the President wasn't going to sign anything that rolled back those executive orders. So the bill is kind of stuck in the Senate. Now, this morning's news, which you may have seen about a Texas federal district court judge, as I understand it, staying the President's executive order, at least in the short term, may allow this bill to move forward, right? Because if you're Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, you no longer need, at least for the moment, to try to attach that provision. So I haven't seen the decision, but in the context of the appropriations, this may mean that this bill can now proceed. I don't know what the next steps are. And then, of course, that's just last year's business. Then we got to go about the business of this year's budget and appropriations process. And I serve on the Budget Committee as the senior Democrat, so we'll be working on those budgets for next year. And that's going to be quite a process, so we can talk about that if you want. It's going to be a bumpy road, but some time to go between now and October 1st, which is the beginning of the next fiscal year. We're operating right now under the Ryan-Murray agreement, which was an agreement on the appropriations that I was very involved in, that provided for a two-year certainty with respect to budget levels. That deal expires, and so there's no deal in place as we head into the next fiscal year, which means there could be, a lot of back and forth, to put it mildly. Then in May, we've got to deal with the Federal Transportation Trust Fund. So in May, the funds coming into the Transportation Trust Fund are not going to be adequate to support a current services budget, let alone, an expanded infrastructure investment plan. So we're going to have to deal with that. The President has a proposal which I've supported, dealing with corporate tax reform and using some of the savings from corporate tax reform to invest in our infrastructure. That has some potential because there's some overlap between the President's plan and some of the Republican plans from last year, but we just don't know right now. And if that doesn't come together, and it will be hard to get that all put together in 5 months, we're going to need at least a short-term mechanism to fund the transportation fund. And Maryland stands to, gain from a transportation trust fund funding. I mean, there are a number of projects we've got, both transit and roads, that would benefit from full funding of transportation. And one of the things we're working on locally, of course, is the I-270 corridor. You've got the, Quarter Cities Transitway, and then you've got the issue of congestion coming down from Frederick County as you head into Montgomery County. So that's going to be an issue we got to work on. Very briefly on the I put forward a plan that I hope will be discussed in the context of the budget and over the next couple of years to try to address this situation of growing sort of middle class squeeze and people who are working harder than ever but have seen their wages stagnate over time. If you look at a chart over time, it's very dramatic. You see worker productivity increasing at a very steady pace since the late 1970s. I mean, this is not just a recent phenomenon. It goes back quite some time. Worker productivity rising rapidly But real wages corrected for inflation, remaining pretty flat for most people. And the question is, how do you deal with that? Because previously, before the late 70s, they really traveled together, increased worker productivity and increasing wages and benefits. There are lots of reasons for this separation, but there are no easy answers. What we proposed is to try to use the tax code to incentivize greater wages primarily from public corporations. We use the tax code for lots of things, some good, some bad. We use it to incentivize savings, which is good. We use it to, promote like racehorses and private jets and all this kind of stuff, which is probably a bad use of the tax code. But I believe we could use the tax code in a positive way to not require but incentivize greater profit sharing plans, greater wages, that kind of thing. And the way you can do it with public corporations anyway is they can currently take significant tax deductions for the bonuses they pay to CEOs and executives over $1 million. And what one measure I proposed would do is say, okay, you can still, you can pay your executives whatever bonus you want. But if you want to take a tax deduction for bonuses over $1 million, then you've got to be either providing your employees with wages that reflect their productivity or engage them in some kind of profit sharing plan. So those are positive ways we can use our tax code to try and get at this gap between worker productivity and frozen real wages. And then there are a number of other proposals to try to encourage more savings, as well as provide greater reward to work in terms of a paycheck, tax credit, a bonus for middle income workers who've been squeezed to give them a little more take-home income. So those are some of the outlines. Happy to go into the more details, but it was a plan that I think has kicked off a good discussion. And the last thing I should mention is this discussion over the authorization to use military force, which is obviously a big debate and very much in the news given what's happening overseas with ISIS. So I support the actions the president is currently undertaking in Iraq and Syria. Specifically, we're providing air power, air support to the Iraqi forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, the Kurdish forces, to stop the ISIL advance in Iraq and begin to try and push them back. In Kobani, which is a town in Syria, our air power helped the Syrian Kurds push the ISIL forces out of that town of Kobani. So I also support training and equipping the Iraqi and Peshmerga forces. What I do not support is a re-engagement of U.S. ground forces in a ground war in the Middle East. I don't think that that's in our interests. I don't think it will accomplish the goal. I think if you look at Iraq, you can see, you can learn the lessons of why American ground forces are not able to necessarily change the political landscape. And if there's no political solution in places like Iraq, then all the U.S. military ground forces in the world are not going to solve the problem and meet the challenge. So yes to U.S. air power to sort of stop the advance of ISIL and target their command and control, their infrastructure. But again, I do not support an open-ended authorization to use force. And the way the president's proposal is written, it provides lots of leeway with respect to ground combat forces. And it leaves in place indefinitely the 2001 authorization to use military force, which was the authorization that was used to go after Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. That remains on the books, and it's had a very expansive interpretation that would allow this president or any future president to take action, including the introduction of U.S. ground forces. So I've proposed, as the president himself did a couple years ago, to amend and eventually sunset that so that you don't have on the books an open-ended authorization. Congress would have to take action in the future before a future president could put U.S. ground forces into harm's way. So that's going to be a big debate. It's not clear how it will all turn out, but it's a conversation we should have and should have started earlier, actually. So why don't I thanks for getting together.
Well, actually, just to kind of piggyback that, do you think enough is being done? Because 2 years ago, ISIS was just in Syria. Now, and 2 years ago, and last year they were in Iraq and Syria, and now they're in Egypt, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. I mean, the latest story, they're just metastasizing at warp speed. So, what?
Sure.
You know what? I mean, I think a year or two ago, most Americans probably didn't think much about it, and all of a sudden, you're looking at these maps in newspapers and stuff where the countries are just lighting up where they have this presence. And is it enough being done? How much should Americans care? Should they?
Yeah,
I mean,
yes,
I think they should.
yeah.
I mean, that's a
yes, we
question,
should
but it's
care.
like, it doesn't
Yeah.
seem like anything is working to curtail their. I mean, they are attracting Muslim extremists daily in countries that we never thought they'd be in, and you know, what?
So
there's no easy answer, but what?
Yeah. So I think we should care because I do think, first of all, they are operationally, they pose an immediate threat to a lot of our friends and allies. They obviously present currently this kind of aspirational threat to lone wolves. I mean, you saw what happened in Paris and then in Copenhagen. So their propaganda has obviously the potential to spread. Now, what do you do about it, though? And how do you effectively address it without actually making the situation even worse from the perspective of the United States? Number one, I think you've got to provide support to the forces on the ground that are available to challenge them. I don't think American ground forces are the answer here. If the Iraqi forces and the Kurdish forces and the Sunnis in places like Iraq aren't going to be there on the ground to push back, then we're not going to be successful. But I do believe that we can, over time, push them back out of some of the cities they've taken in Anbar province in Iraq. Syria is a little tougher. But let me just say that, I mean, these guys began, I mean, the history of ISIL is they began as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So al-Baghdadi, their leader, is an Iraqi. When we went into Iraq back in 2003, we took the lid off Pandora's box, and you saw all the groups, the Kurds, the Sunni, the Shia, that had been sort of held together by brute force, all of a sudden competing for power. And in the end, you had the Shia majority take control from what had been the regime of Saddam Hussein, which was the Sunni minority in control of a majority Shia country. That in the process alienated the Sunnis. And what happened was when Maliki was prime minister, instead of ruling as a national Iraqi leader, he ruled as a Shia leader. And so the Sunnis, who at the end of the Iraq War had been willing to give the idea of a central Iraq government a chance, decided that the government was not for them, that it was only for Shia. And therefore, they kind of allowed the ISIL forces to take over these areas in the Sunni parts of Iraq. And in order to get them back, we're going to need Sunni Arab forces to do the job, because Shia forces will just alienate them more, these Shia militias that are going in. The Kurdish forces are also seen as a sort of outside group to the Sunnis. So standing up a Sunni National Guard is the challenge in Iraq right now, and it's going to take some time. But the idea of American forces going into cities like Mosul will not accomplish the goal, because otherwise you're going to have U.S. forces in the middle of a civil war, and that's a recipe for getting tied down forever without accomplishing the goal. I would just say in Libya, what's happening is there are these fringe groups, like this group responsible for the awful beheadings of the Coptics, Egyptian Copts. This is not a big group within Libya. They're not a powerful group in Libya. They are competing for power in Libya against much larger groups. And this is a way of franchising themselves to ISIL, gaining attention. I believe that we should support the Egyptian action. I mean, they use their air power, and so we need to push. But the idea of U.S. forces on the ground, I think, is not only puts our forces in harm's way unnecessarily. I don't think it all begins to accomplish the goal. So, supporting local forces, supporting the Egyptian government, the Saudi government, Jordanian government, by being the lead on air power as we are, I believe is the best strategy. So, complicated question.
Yeah, it's
Well, the black hole of the center of it seems to be Syria. So what's the end game in Syria? You have a great choice here. You have Assad and you have ISIL.
Yeah.
What do you want?
Well, I actually agree that while we should not be making, quote, common cause with Assad, that we do need to recognize that ISIL is the greater threat, and we should be focused on that threat.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
We should continue to push the other major players in the region for an ultimate transition government in Damascus, recognizing that will take time, and the immediate focus should be on squeezing ISIL, which, as you said, is also the enemy of Assad. One of the most difficult things here has been that our allies in the region have had the reversed priority, right? So if you were to ask the Turks, for example, whether they would prefer to get rid of ISIL or Assad, they would say Assad. And there are elements in Saudi Arabia that were originally funded ISIL. I mean, Turkey allowed a lot of these guys to come through Turkey originally. And that's why it's been so hard to negotiate with those guys. I mean, the Turks won't allow us to use the airbase in southeastern Turkey, our own airbase, for flights, in Syria, for our flights in Syria, because their objective, unless we agree that we're going to go after Assad. And, I think the concern is if you go after Assad without a good transition plan, you end up with Libya in Syria. And then you see, some of the minority groups, like the Christians in Syria, like the Alawites in Syria, just become the victims of a massacre.
So are we seeing the potential seeds of their demise, at least outside of Syria, ISIL's demise, with actions against the Jordanians, the Japanese, the Egyptians? I mean, have they successfully inflamed enough people?
I think especially what they did to the Jordanian pilot clearly rallied support in Jordan that had not been there previously. I think in Jordan the population had very mixed feelings about ISIL. Again, because you've got as you know, in the world, you have this major Sunni-Shia divide, right? And, the Sunnis in places like Saudi Arabia and Jordan obviously are horrified by the way Assad has treated the Sunni populations in Syria. And so there's a lot of anti-Assad sentiment, understandably. And so that sentiment sometimes leads to, in the past, not necessarily support, but understanding for the ISIL position, which is obviously an extremist, branch of Sunni Islam. But when ISIL took the kind of actions they did against the Jordanian pilot, it helped rally. So what we really need is the so-called moderate Arab states with Sunni states to take on the fight against this rabid, version of it.
Difficult.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the middle class plan?
Sure.
It seemed, so I got a chance to read you sent along a link to the overview of the plan, and so I gotta say there's some great ideas on the fun side, right? Which is like how to reward work and make the system more progressive. I mean, there's a lot of neat things. I mean, I like the second earner thing. I mean, there's like, who doesn't like $1,000? It seems like the other side's the hard part, and there aren't as many details there, and that's really where the crux of it comes. I mean, you talked about the tax deduction, for the bonuses and how you kind of incentivize different behavior for publicly traded companies. That's one area, and I'm curious about that because it seems like those tests are so hard to administer, or could be so hard to administer. Whether or not the wages reflect the productivity. I mean, how do you measure that? How do you really assess that in a way that's clean, clear, and simple, or even whether they're really sharing profits in a way that's meaningful? That seems difficult. So I'd be interested to hear that.
Sure.
What you're taking on that. Also, as a second thing, you sort of talk, and I know there's been a lot of talk about the potential for some common ground on tax reform, and in this you talk about like the CBO report and the $1.5 trillion over 10 years or whatever it is, the money that goes to the top 1% essentially.
Yeah.
I think the rest of all the fun stuff depends on finding money either in the stuff that's identified in the CBO report, primarily to fund that, and then there's the challenge I see with the tax deduction or for the bonuses and all the rest of that is the mechanics of it. How does that work?
Right. So all good questions. And we looked at different ways to measure productivity, and it gets very difficult to do it on a company by company basis. So we didn't do that. We went back to a measure that's provided by the Department of Labor, which is the productivity growth in the country. And our view is that if a company is in the position to be giving its top executives multi-million-dollar bonuses and getting a tax deduction right off for those, that their workers must be providing the kind of productivity that at least matches the productivity in the economy, right? I mean, you're a company that's doing well. You're rewarding your CEOs and executives. So our idea is that you should be at least, as I say, compensating your employees at the value of productivity. And there is a clear measure of productivity in the economy wide. It's not huge. I mean, it's about we anchored it in the year 2000 till now. It's about 2%. So we're talking about 2% plus cost of living, but it compounds over time, right? So the idea was to get at this huge gap between, as I said, rising worker productivity over time and flat wages, and the curve that measures worker productivity in the economy is what we're using. It's a Department of Labor measure of productivity. So the idea is if your company's doing well and you're providing these bonuses and deducting them, that you should also be providing your employees with increased compensation that reflects worker productivity in the economy. Again, you can.
Why not just eliminate them, or why not just not allow those deductions? Period.
Well, what we want to do is that's actually a good question. I mean, I had that proposal at one point. So what we're trying to do is use the tax code to incentivize increased wages for workers. You could do exactly what you're proposing. That would obviously take away the leverage if you just said It would take away the carrot, exactly.
Yeah.
So our view is the carrots, right now you get the carrot, but you don't have to give anything
Yeah.
for the benefit of a deduction. So, why not tie that carrot, that current benefit, to something? And if you don't do it, then you will not be able to take the deduction. So, people say, well, this might not work, and if that's true, then the deficit goes down because people can no longer take
Right.
these big deductions. And the deductions are actually much larger than I thought. So between 2007 and 2010, there are about $65 billion in deductions claimed. So this is actually it's an attractive carrot. I mean, if you lose this deduction, we're talking about big dollars. Now that's the amount deducted, right? So
Yeah.
your tax benefit is the amount deducted, times your tax rate, which is 35% or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a big number,
Yeah.
and you could just take it away. It's interesting how this has developed over time because under current law, a public corporation cannot deduct the value of salaries above $1 million. You can't deduct that salary. So you can't pay anyone. If you pay someone $2 million, you can deduct the first $1 million, but not.
Right.
So the way around that has been to take that compensation above $1 million, not in the form of salary, but in the form of bonuses or performance pay.
Mhm.
So what this says is, okay, if you're going to take that and deduct it, you as a company have also got to be sharing some of the gains through higher wages and compensation with your employees. So, we think it's a pretty, again, taxpayers should not be subsidizing big bonuses for these corporations unless they're providing these higher wages. Now on the really quickly on
high income earners.
so on the other piece that's really how you pay for it, right?
Yeah.
So right now, if you look at our tax code, it does tax, and this isn't my term, it's the tax code, unearned income at more favorable rates than earned income. And so the idea is to move the tax code in a way that doesn't provide preferential treatment to unearned income. When Ronald Reagan was president, we had the same tax rate for capital gains as we did for earned income, 28%. So, and the president's budget actually makes it. Sorry, let me turn this on. The president's. Is that me? Yeah. It's not me. The president's budget actually, this year's budget begins to move more in the direction that I was talking about when I rolled out my plan. The tax code, I mean, it's just, the more you dig into it, the more strange it gets. I mean, you can see what's happened over time. And if you look at what the Congressional Budget Office calls tax expenditures, they exceed in value on an annual basis the amount we spend on Social Security. Now tax expenditures what are tax expenditures, right? They're the exceptions, or they're the credits, deductions to the existing tax code. Some of them have a great right? You put away money in a savings account, you get tax preferred status. So we can agree that may be a good incentive to do the tax, but it is an incentive, right? I mean, people who don't do that, they pay full freight on those extra dollars that they didn't put away. So that's why economists call those tax expenditures, because they're exceptions to the liability you would otherwise pay if you had a uniform, if you didn't have a credit or a deduction. And if you add all those up in the tax code, what they call tax expenditures, they exceed the amount, as I said, we spend on Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. So the question is, okay, of those tax expenditures, which ones have worthy policy goals and which ones are unnecessary? And if you look at the distribution of tax expenditures, 17% of the benefit of tax expenditures goes to the top 1% income earners. And that is in large part because of the preferred tax treatment of unearned income. Money made from money as opposed to money made from work. So we just look at that category and say, as part of tax reform, you're not talking about increasing the top income tax rates, but you are talking about reducing the value of some of these tax expenditures, especially for the top 1%. And then the other proposal out there was to look at this idea of a market trading fee, which is an idea a number of economists have looked at. The EU is looking at it in moving forward in 2016. And the idea is a very small fee, meaning 0.1% on trades in stocks, bonds, and derivatives. The London Stock Exchange currently has a fee that's 5 times higher than the one I'm proposing. And if you think about sort of the equities, right now we have a sales tax in Maryland, I think it's like 6% or something. So when you go buy your kids' clothes, shoes, you're paying 6%. What we're talking about is something 1/60th of that on trading and derivatives and things like that. And if you do it together with the EU, you can avoid the very real problem of people just moving their trading operations overseas. So you want to do it in tandem with other major financial markets. Anyway, that's another area where we think that you could change the tax code and in a way that allows us to move toward one that rewards work over just money for money.
You were jumping in.
I think you actually tackled my question as well, is to prevent these corporations from just, upping and moving overseas and keeping them in the country.
Yeah. So it's interesting because what happens is, the lobbyists for the major financial centers, right? Whenever you talk about this idea in the United States, they say, oh, you can't do it because all the trades are going to go from New York to London and elsewhere. And it's true. And then whenever they talk about doing it in London and EU, they run over there and say all the trades are going to go to New York and Chicago. So yeah, you have to do it. You have to do it together. But I would again point out that the UK currently has this fee on stock transactions on the London Stock Exchange. It's 5 times higher than the fee we're talking about on a broader set of transactions. And they haven't seen as much leakage as you might suspect from their stock trading.
And there's no laws against collusion among international entities, is there?
Right, sure.
But wouldn't the buy-in have to be someplace like China, where, they're going to move to Hong Kong?
Well, Hong Kong actually has a little bit of a fee. And Singapore already has one. Paris has one. So you would want to do it in coordination.
So you have to coordinate.
You have to coordinate. You have to coordinate. But one of the things we've learned from looking at the behavior in the London Stock Exchange is, again, you would have thought a lot more trades would migrate out of the London Stock Exchange because of this fee, and they haven't. So yes, you have to worry, and you have to coordinate. But as I said, the EU right now is planning. I mean, the EU is moving ahead right now, trying to put this into place sometime in 2016, 2017 timeframe.
So these are, of course, politically difficult but interesting positions and a good debate over them. But I wanted to take it even another level. All right, so I've read but have not fully absorbed, and it may take several more readings before I can, if possible, even absorb the whole Piketty book. And fascinating. But what's interesting is I look at what you're talking about here is you're talking about the income side. And that's actually kind of a small piece of the disparity in opportunity and wealth that, the picture, the portrait of the United States that comes out of that book is damning. I mean, it's worse inequality of opportunity and wealth than, France in the 1890s or whatever. It's just incredible and headed to be even worse. All the trends. But the biggest piece of that really seems to be on the transfer of wealth from generation to generation and the accumulation of wealth. You're talking about addressing it on the income side.
Yeah.
the irony to me seems to be that there's more popular opposition to changes on inheritance than there is on adjustments on the income side, which theoretically at least rewards work and opportunity and all the rest of it. But we're able to make some progress there with progressive income taxes.
Yeah.
But talk about the inheritance side or the wealth accumulation side. Or do you even
Right,
see
so
that as an
actually,
issue?
you're right. If you look at, because if you look at charts of, growth of income disparity over time, you see a huge increase, obviously. But you see even bigger increase in
Right.
wealth disparity.
Concentration of wealth.
Yeah, even bigger and faster.
Yeah.
And it's partly because of the tax code does allow a lot of inherited wealth to pass from generation to generation. Now, interestingly, one of the president's proposals, this is something I put forward too, changes the issue of what's stepped up basis of death for taxes, right? So right now, you have a bunch of stock, right? Normally, if you sold that stock, right, you would calculate the increase in value over the stock, and you'd pay capital gains on that. But of course, if someone holds a lot of stock, just using stock as an example, and dies, there's what's called the step up in basis. The heirs get the stock at the current value, and so the step up, the gain, is never subject to a capital gains tax, which allows this wealth to pass from generation to generation without any tax. So one of the president's proposals, he calls it the trust fund loophole, is to address this issue of step up in basis at death, which is something that we also. So when I mentioned that 17% of the tax expenditures go to the top 1%, that's an interestingly big part of it.
Okay, so it's not just on income, like.
No, but that's
earned income.
not just on earned income. No, in fact, the whole idea here is to try to, end the biases in the current code, the slant in the current code that gives preferential treatment to unearned income over earned income,
Okay.
right? I mean,
Right.
the code is, it also has a lower tax rate, right? Until recently, it was like 15% on capital gains. Now it's about 23%. The president is talking about taking it back to where it was when Ronald Reagan was president, 28%. A lot of people would argue there's absolutely no reason that it shouldn't be the same as the earned income top tax rate, which is 39%. So you can have a debate over that, but the point is exactly what you were saying, which is to get at this issue of preferential treatment on what I say is money made off of money versus money made off of hard work and labor. The other thing I would, what else was I going to mention? Oh yeah, so part of the proposal I put forward is also to create an incentive for folks in the middle and lower income earners to save more, to address this disparity, right? Because right now, the people who are able to save are people who have enough income to be able to meet their daily needs, and then they can save, which is a good thing. And so part of the proposal I made was to provide a paycheck bonus credit to reward work, but also say that if you put aside in a savings account at least $500 of that, you'll get a $250 tax credit match. Because one of the problems we're seeing is more and more Americans hitting their retirement age without having really prepared for it. So this would actually allow you to do it in one place. When you file your tax code, you could direct a certain amount of money toward your IRA or 401k. If your employer is not offering a 401k or IRA, the president last year announced these MIRAs. Anyway, the Treasury Department will soon announce these MIRA accounts, which would allow people to essentially put their money into these accounts tax-free. So allowing many more Americans to take advantage of the kind of tax savings vehicles
Right.
that you know, a lot of, like the federal government has a 401k plan. But, you know, a lot of people, about 50% of Americans do not have access to a 401k plan. If you don't have some kind of easy access to those plans, it's very rare that people set them up. I mean, some people will go set them up, but we're trying to make it easier for people to set up and access those accounts, and then through your tax form under this proposal, you'd be able to immediately direct some of your tax savings into one of these
That
accounts.
tax credit though, right?
And you would get a tax credit.
No, I mean, you could take some of your tax credit and put that into.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
And then if you put, you said, what was it, $500 in? You'd
500
get-
or plus.
You'd get a $250 credit on top of that for doing that?
If you put $500 in, I mean, if you put $500 in your tax, through your taxes
Right.
form into that, you get a $250 credit, tax
Credit, not a deduction, a credit.
credit. Yeah.
Pretty good. So,
Okay.
in a kind of political caricature, a lot of what you're talking about is, you know, Democratic, focusing on redistribution and equality. Where's the overlap? Where's the, I mean, obviously, certainly at the moment, and who knows when, the Democrats don't have the power to do this on their own. Where's the overlap with Republican interests? Where in the GOP side can you find common ground? I mean, it seems like there's been some noise about closing corporate tax havens and loopholes, but not a lot, and mostly interest in flat taxes, which moves in the opposite direction.
Right.
Where's the overlap?
So two things. First of all, I would argue, and this is, you know, why I think it's worth looking at the current tax code, that the current tax code, actually, because of it favors unearned income. The current tax code has been written over time in a way that redistributes income, you know, toward, you know, as you said, people who are primarily making money off of money, right? I mean, Warren Buffett does great, as he's mentioned. And so it's really just trying to rebalance the code to have a system that rewards work equally. So that's one point. And the other point is in terms of the economy, you know, I do believe that the economy grows fastest when more people have the ability to go out and buy goods and services. I mean, I call it the Henry Ford principle, who increased his workers' pay, and that allowed them to have enough money to go out and buy the cars that they were coming off of the assembly line, and they did better, and Henry Ford sold a lot more cars, and he did better too. So it's a very different view of the economy than some of our supply side Republican friends have. It's more of you know, it's what the president means when he says middle class economics, the idea that if more people have more disposable income, they can spend more and also save more for the future. So where's the overlap? And you're right, this is a problem, because the Republican approach so far on tax policy remains, you know, this idea, which I don't think has been proven in the real world recently, but that if you just reduce the top tax rate, you know, from 39% to 25%, that somehow the trickle-down impact will help grow the entire economy, right? If you cut taxes for folks at the very top, that somehow the benefit of that will trickle down and lift all boats.
As it is in Kansas.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, Kansas it's, you know, again, been shown to be a failure. It was a total failure from 2001 to 2003. What went up were the incomes of, you know, very wealthy people, and the deficit went way up. So, again, where's the overlap? There may be some common ground in one area of the tax code, which is the business corporate tax side of the code, where there's general agreement that the way the code works now, especially as it relates to international taxation, is totally broken. So you've got a 35% top corporate rate, but because of all the deductions on the corporate side, you have an effective tax rate much lower than that. You've got some companies that have, you know, an army of tax lawyers like General Electric that pay virtually no corporate tax. You have some domestic manufacturers that get a little bit of a domestic manufacturing break, but they pay much higher effective tax. A lot of these international corporations, which essentially are able to park a lot of their proceeds from operations overseas have very low effective tax rates. So this is where there's some overlap. There's overlap in the idea that you bring down the corporate tax rate. You do it in a deficit neutral way by expanding the base and getting rid of some of the tax breaks. One of the biggest ones for overseas operations is deferral. So as long as you hold your money overseas, it's not taxed. And the idea is, instead of taxing that overseas income at the 35% rate, you bring down the rate the president's proposed, 19% now, as a rate on overseas earned income. And also a one-time rate on your, so that would be on a going forward basis. He's also proposing a 12% tax rate on all overseas held profits right now, about $2 trillion. That's the money the president's plan would use for infrastructure. And Dave Camp, who's the prior Republican chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, had a plan that had many of the same elements. He had different numbers. He didn't have 12%, he had like 5%. His hybrid rate was not 19, it was lower. I mean, his overseas rate going forward. So, but the concepts overlaps, and so this is one area where there may be some possibility, but there's so many details that need to be worked out. But that's the one area. Business tax reform, corporate tax reform is an area where there's some overlap.
So there's always unintended consequences, everything.
Yes.
And focusing on companies and transfer taxes or left taxes or whatever they're called. I kind of take that stuff personally because we're the last independent family-owned newspaper in Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
And we're taxing the next generation sitting right here. It almost forces us into selling the company to pay for taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Just like family farms. There are fewer and fewer family farms because you can't pass it on to your kids. All the values in the land, and that can't pay taxes in land.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm just don't have a question. I just throw that
So
out
no,
there.
I'm glad you raised that. So two things, well, and I'm really glad you raised it, because the president's proposal, and we would, if we moved forward on our proposal, we would have the same provisions. They actually address that issue. So with respect to family farms and businesses that are being passed on, an operating business, you would not have the step up in basis, right? And there's also an exemption for home ownership transfer. So again, if you're, in fact, it was interesting because we looked at the numbers of the president's budget, and the number generated, the revenue number generated from the step up in basis was a lot lower than some of the estimates we've seen. And one of the reasons was, appropriately, the president carved out provisions with respect to family businesses and family farms. But, for example, if someone had just a lot of stock, for example, in the company, it wasn't a publicly owned stock, it would apply. The president's plan would apply to that. And I think rightly so, because otherwise you're allowing, what you're doing is you're passing on from generation to generation, not through transfer of family business, but just through the transfer of wealth in a way that compounds the growing huge disparity, wealth disparity. And we have a capital gains tax. I mean, right now, the current rules for step up in basis and death are a way to avoid the capital gains tax. So people who are making money in the stock market, never are able to pass on that gain forever, whereas somebody who's working, for wages is immediately taxed on their wages. But I'm glad you asked that, because there are provisions to deal with the issues of family farms, which I think is a very fair point to raise.
What's close to 11:30? Any other questions or anything else you want to say? Can you take off?
No, you covered a lot of
Appreciate you stopping by.
domestic issues, foreign
Can I
policy.
have one forward-looking
Sure.
question? Who in the Democratic Party is positioned to be the standard bearer for this kind of message going into the next presidential cycle?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think it's a jump ball, really. I mean, I think we'll have to see who decides to make these issues part of their platform. Interestingly, about 3 days after I put forward this proposal, there was Larry Summers and a group that had been working on these issues for a couple years put forward a plan that contains lots of the same elements, including a version of what I was talking about on the tying the deduction for bonuses to worker pay. They tied it not to any wages. They tied it only to profit sharing plans. Which, as I said, we've got a version of that too. That gets actually a little more complicated than the wage thing. Although you could structure it as well. So there was a lot of overlap. One of the proposals I had was also to provide a tax deduction for companies that have these apprenticeship programs. South Carolina has a really good model, and we've seen a lot more collaboration in Maryland and around the country between community colleges and businesses, which has been really good. We want to encourage more of that, so that more kids who are graduating have the skills they need to be immediately employable. And some of these apprenticeship programs that you've seen in Germany have been very successful at doing that as well. I mean, I think we got to get away from this idea. I think slowly we are, that somehow community college education is somehow not inferior to other forms of higher education. And some people do the 2 years and they get the training they need. Some people do the 2 years and they decide to go and do the full 4 years. I just think we need to move in a direction where people can get the skills that they really need to find a place in the workforce. So anyway, that's another element of the plan. But